WhatsApp groups, because I think the other
That would be great.
college, yeah, I think the other meetings that we have usually start at 7, and we have a lot of
No,
parents who have to
this year we've been
commute.
at 6:30 for all of them, but yes, that would be great if you can do that, because
Yeah, because
I
as a
think that,
commuter, I empathize that people might be, just now pulling in. So,
yes. Okay, but I think we can go ahead and get started either way. Yeah. Okay, we are on record, so I don't need to do that. But I am, for anyone here who doesn't know me, I'm Danielle Batchelor. I have a junior Colson at Carnegie. And this is our college readiness series, which is really designed by the PTO to offer support and guidance and info for parents, especially. Kids are welcome to participate and join us, but it just gives us a view into how we can support the college application process. So we have here Sarah Berard from Compass, and Compass Education Group is pretty much like the OG and everything in the future also, I think, of college, standardized testing for college admittance. And they're very, I keep saying, while I try to think of how to do justice to what you all do, but really tied into the trends, what's happening, especially since COVID, all the changes that are still happening, and the data, like what actually works for students taking different tests, different types of test takers, different types of students, and all that. So I will stop yammering and turn it over to Sarah, and she can introduce herself.
Thank you so much. Thanks to the community for having me speak at this meeting. Just real quick, my background goes all the way to my undergrad days. I went to Wheaton College in Massachusetts. I started working for the Princeton Review as a test prep tutor and a teacher when I was an undergrad. And then over the years, I've worked for a few companies. My longest tenure with Compass Education Group. We actually have a Houston location now. We also have offices in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, and Chicago. And my work as a program director, my days of tutoring are over, but my work as a program director is such that I help look at potential test pathways for students and talk a lot about, as Danielle said, the current trends and everything that's happening specifically in the world of admissions testing. We're not a college counseling firm, so definitely get advice from your leaders or the counseling department at the school. There's people who also provide those services. Compass stays in our lane, and we really do focus on the test prep part. And this presentation tonight is going to cover some of the most common questions that I get as a director when families and students are calling in for the first time, asking what to do in this new world of test-free, test optional, a growing list of test required, and all the different, quite frankly, pretty complicated policies that everyone is dealing with in this new world of testing. So here are some of the things we're going to cover this evening. I will ask to please hold your questions until the end of the slideshow presentation. We will build in some time to answer live questions, or you can type right into the chat and we'll check them later. But again, here's what we will cover. We'll talk about the testing landscape, the newer policies, what's required, what's not required. We'll talk about the difference between the tests. Many students, even if they are applying to schools that might be test-free or holistically test optional, they might want to put their hat in the ring for an official score just in case they need it. And we'll go over the whys and hows as far as that works. We'll also talk about when students should plan to take their test. So if I have parents of 9th or 10th graders, you're looking into the future. If we have 11th grade parents and students here, we're probably talking about something that is either just about to start or you may be in the process of. Then I'll cover what test prep looks like. A lot of it will come from our experience at Compass, but in general terms, just what to expect and what a good test prep program would look like. And then finally touch a little bit on how official scores, assuming your student moves forward with test taking, how those scores are used and how to submit them. So let's jump right in with the testing landscape. Before I do though, just one quick plug, this link here, compassprep.com/Compass Guide with a hyphen between Compass and Guide, has everything I'm mentioning in even greater detail. If you have to jump off this call tonight and just want to download a free resource with just about everything you need to know about policies and testing, we update this guide seasonally, so it has all the latest from all the top schools in the country, as well as wonderful descriptions of SAT and ACT testing. So our guide, again, please download, look it up on our website, and that's a wonderful resource for parents and students. Okay, so let's jump into why test scores are still a data point that can be considered valuable at a number of universities and colleges across the US. Again, you've probably heard that 95% of schools are optional, and that is a fact. However, more information, especially a student who is capable of turning in a strong test score, can really help grease the wheels, so to speak, can really help students along with their admissions process when they have valuable test scores to add to their transcript. Why is that if they have great grades? Well, this slide shows the average GPAs of students in roughly the last 15 years. And what you're seeing, especially with that yellow data point, the yellow blocks represent an A average, so a 4.0 or better. And this is a selection that we got directly from the ACT. This is college-bound seniors who took the ACT. So these are self-reported grades. But what you're seeing, even in the last, the final few years, is in 2018, it was about 46% of college-bound applicants turning in a 4.0. And even a few years later, it's into almost 55% of students with, again, an A average or better. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, that was not the case. So this illustrates that grade inflation does indeed exist. And on the ACT, and if there was an SAT graphic, it would look similar, the bell curve stays consistent. So in other words, there is grade inflation, and yet the ability for students on a nationwide level to hit the most competitive SAT and ACT scores has stayed consistent over time, where again, those grades do move up. As far as what the schools require, this first graphic shows what things were like pre-pandemic. So in 2018, 2019, almost 2/3 of the 400 schools that we profile, that's not fully, every single school in the country, but we profile over 400 schools that are considered competitive across each state. And again, 4 or 5 years ago, 2/3 of schools outright required the applicant to turn in an SAT or ACT along with their GPA and their transcripts and everything else. Fast forward to the current policy, there's only 4% of colleges and universities that require an SAT or ACT. The vast majority are what's referred to as test optional. We'll get into the breakdown of the different categories, but you can see that almost 90% of schools are optional, meaning you don't need to turn in scores. You can, if you feel like, again, it will highlight you as a student, you have some strong scores. We recommend turning in numbers, again, if your numbers align with the traditional expectations at that school. And you can do your research using our guide and lots of publicly available info. Then the final category, test free, means just like it sounds. There are a number of schools that will not take test scores into consideration at all. Okay, so knowing that it's a tiny percentage that require tests, a larger band that will take tests if they're helpful, and then another chunk that won't look at scores at all, you may be asking yourself, well, what do we do? What do I do with my student? And the way to answer that is to start doing your research on where your student might even be mildly interested in applying for colleges. So this case study is based on a real Compass student who lives in the DC area. She happens to have a parent who is a Georgetown alum. So Georgetown was on the top of her list. She goes to a competitive private school. She has pretty wonderful grades. And this is her short list where we highlighted the policies at some of the schools that she's interested in to illustrate the process of deciding whether you want to take tests. So top of her list was the no-brainer. Georgetown, spoiler alert, is one of the schools that requires SAT and ACT. They're part of that tiny 4% that have returned to mandatory test taking as part of the application process. Then her other top choices, Fordham, BC, Boston College, and Santa Clara, have varying test optional admissions policies. Couple of those schools have not yet announced what will happen for maybe some of you here tonight in the class of 2025. About 47%, again, of those optional choices have not yet made their new policies for next year. Quite a few are what they call permanently optional. So again, you can do your research and see those. But for Sally's student, our example here, she knew she needed scores for Georgetown, and then looking at schools like Fordham and BC, she knew that a competitive score would be helpful with her process, so she engaged with Compass. How do we know that those scores might be helpful? Well, here is an interesting graphic. This is a selection of schools that actually did release data on how students were admitted to their colleges, both with no tests or with tests. So if you look at the lighter color, sort of the left side of either the yellow or the dark green, that represents students who applied to the school and got in with no test scores. Now, these again were a few years ago, 2021 and 2022. Many schools will not release this information. They'll just tell us how many kids got in, but they won't share the details of whether the students got in with or without test scores. So you can see to the left, Northeastern, they sort of walk the walk and talk the talk. If you were an applicant, early decision, by the way, look at that parenthetical. If you applied early decision Northeastern with scores or without, you had almost exactly the same shot at getting an acceptance letter from Northeastern. Again, that's early decision, so you can see that number is pretty high. But if you go to the far right, BC is for Boston College, and that left side, again, are applicants' regular decision, not early, getting in at about 9% with no test scores. Students who applied to BC in 2022 with test scores got in at over 25%. Now, does that mean that it was scores alone that got that 25% into Boston College? Probably not. It was probably good scores. So we have to look at the full context of the historical ranges of test scores. But I think you can see by this graphic that if and when a student applies with strong test scores, it is only going to help their chances at getting into some of the most competitive schools in the country. So that is that graphic. And then we have direct quotes from a couple of competitive schools. Specifically on this slide, we have a statement from Brown and we have a statement from MIT. I'm going to just quickly skim these, but kind of think in the back of your mind, guess perhaps what these policies are as far as required, test optional, or test free at Brown and MIT respectively. So Christina from Brown says, standardized testing has been criticized as an inaccurate predictor of success, yet data show that these tests do reveal useful information about whether students will on average be academically successful at Brown. And she goes on to say that test scores are a much better predictor of academic success, again, at Brown, than high school grades. Now we have Stewart from MIT, obviously a prestigious school, more on your math and science side. And he says outright, in short, our research has shown that in most cases, we cannot reliably predict students will do well at MIT unless we consider standardized test results alongside grades, coursework, and other factors. And then the last sentence there says, the math component of the testing, shocker, turns out to be the most important. So what are the policies currently at Brown and MIT? Well, Brown, even though they say it's valuable and that they like test scores, Brown is still test optional, whereas MIT, it is required. If you are applying as a freshman to MIT, you must turn in either an SAT or ACT score. This is the short list, MIT at the top, of colleges that do require test scores. The newest ones are Purdue, Morehouse, and Georgia Tech. The entire Georgia and Florida and Tennessee state systems all, again, require test scores if a student is applying to those colleges or universities. Then we have the opposite side of the coin, which are referred to as test-free universities. A lot of it is California, the entire Cal State system, as well as the University of California, including UC Berkeley, UCLA, UC Santa Barbara. Really strong institutions have gone from looking at test scores to now saying, even if you have a perfect score, we don't want them. Okay, these schools on this short list are test-free. I think one of the more interesting ones, especially because we just talked about MIT as a required institution, Caltech, which is kind of the West Coast MIT, they don't look at standardized test scores. Now, do they look at AP test scores? Yes, they do. Do they look at GPA? Absolutely. Do you have to take extremely rigorous courses to get into a school like Caltech? Yes, you do, but they do not take SAT or ACT scores, which is interesting. All right, so let's say that you now have decided, let's at least put our hat in the ring. Let's decide whether my student, if you're a student, whether you want to try an SAT or ACT. So I like to run through some of these misconceptions or common conceptions, if you will, on the two tests by doing this little pop quiz. It's a true or false style. And the first one I get a lot is, hey, some colleges prefer the ACT over the new digital SAT, right? Or people like the SAT. I didn't grow up with the ACT. What I can promise everyone, colleges do not have a preference, right? There's no bias toward the ACT or SAT. Maybe 30 years ago, regionally, there was more of a split where sort of the middle of the country took more ACTs, the East Coast and West Coast were more SAT. But I promise you, as a veteran of the test prep world, everything is equal now. And so all you need to do is help your student figure out which one they hate less via practice testing and decide which test to move forward with. Next thing, true or false, if students can score well on both tests, they should take them both. I actually say a big false to this. If you have a student in the junior year, or even summer before junior year, don't make them do twice the work for the same result, okay? The SAT and ACT, again, are seen as equals in the eyes of every college and university in the country. You don't need to make your student take both, even if they're capable of very strong scores. Choose between the two with a practice test. The third one is really popular for those parents or students in the 11th grade. They talk about the PSAT. So is it true or false that the PSAT can be used as a reliable practice for the full SAT? Luckily, the answer to that is true, okay? the official PSAT scoring is what's called vertically aligned with SAT scores. So in other words, if you got a 1220 on your PSAT back in October with a 600 verbal and a 620 math, and you took the full SAT a week later or a month later, you'll likely be at a 1220. You can't sort of artificially inflate it, nor should you expect it will go lower because one was easier or more difficult. The only difference now between the two tests, they're the same length, same amount of questions, but there is a little cap on the scoring and the difficulty. So your top PSAT verbal is a 760. Your math is also a 760 as a max score. And then the full test does go to an 800. But again, reliable, vertically aligned scoring. So if your student did a PSAT back in October, you don't necessarily need to make her do another practice test, although sometimes you want one, right? And I'd be happy to provide one. I'll put my contact info at the end if your student is interested in trying a practice test before moving forward. All right, so that's our true false. Let's jump into what to expect on these tests. For those of you who are not aware, the SAT has gone through a major makeover. So this past October was sort of the debut of the brand new digital style PSAT and SAT. There was a November and a December paper-based SAT that some juniors might have tried, but as of March 9th, this next official SAT, everything forward forever and ever, or at least until they change it again, is again this new digital test. Good news, it's only 2 hours and 14 minutes in length instead of the traditional 3 hours and 5 minutes. We love that. The parts that are new is the fact that this is a digital adaptive test. So what that means, and you can see the graphic, the red verbal, section 1, 32 minutes of reading passages and boring grammar, right? That's basically what's tested. Depending on the student's performance in section number 1, the student gets moved to either section 2A or to 2B. They have to get at least 2/3 of the questions correct in the first section to be moved along to the more challenging second section 2B. If they get less than 2/3 correct, you're going to get shuttled along to actually the slightly easier section 2. And what happens there is it allows tests to be made shorter, and it will sort of sort students in a more efficient manner than a static paper test where every kid in the room has the same 200 questions, and it's just how many you got correct equals your score. That's what the tests have been for years and years. Now we have this new adaptive model where you have to perform at a certain level in section 1 in order to be moved to the more difficult section 2. And the ceiling for where your score can go is determined on whether you get moved to the A or the B. So that again, it used to be everyone in the room got the same test, same booklet. Now we have this varied test structure because it is newly digital adaptive. So here's another kind of detailed look at that. Here is students, again, to the left is module 1, where there's 5 easy, 10 medium, and 5 extra difficult, the dark blue. If they got more than 2/3 correct out of those first 20, they get moved to module B, where there's a larger concentration of difficult questions. And those are the kids who can go up to the highest level on the 200 to 800 scale. That's the new thing with adaptive testing. What is on the test is explained in these next 2 slides. So verbal covers reading, which is just what it sounds like, passages, followed by an analysis of passages, reading passages. And then you have what's called writing, and that's really grammar, okay? It's testing subject-verb agreement. It might be testing a comma splice. It might ask a student to rearrange a sentence for clarity. So reading and writing, no more vocab, by the way. Remember those old analogies and fill in the blank vocab? That's long gone. The verbal on the SAT tests the Again, reading skills as well as writing and grammar. On the math, you have 2 math modules covering these topics. Algebra, which is basically both Algebra 1 and a little bit of Algebra 2. Advanced math gets into more of the Algebra 2. Geometry and trig speaks for itself. Notice that that's 15%. I will say about ACT, there's more geometry than on the new SAT. And then there's sort of general math like the problem solving and data analysis. Some of the content kids have to go back and review. Maybe they haven't touched geometry in 2 years. We can do that within our curriculum. There's also lots of free resources like the College Board downloadable digital tests, as well as the Khan Academy site, which is through College Board, where you and your students can get more resources. But here again is what is covered. Flipping over to the other test that people are considering, we have the ACT. ACT has 4 different scores instead of 2. So again, SAT has up to 800 verbal, 800 math, whereas ACT has 4 separate numbers: English, which is grammar, math, which is math, reading, which is a reading section, and then finally, the part that makes the ACT unique is the 4th section called science. Good news on science is it's not like high-level high school science knowledge. It's more information that a student is looking at and synthesizing, and all of the detail to get a great science score, believe it or not, is on the page. Now, does that mean that your student is going to like the ACT science? Maybe not, but that's why I say try a practice test first. But those are the 4 sections of ACT. My little notes there say, please do not register your child for the essay. It is still offered, but I promise you it is not required or even assessed by any college in the country. College Board and the digital SAT have gotten rid of the essay permanently, but ACT still offers it. Don't sign up for it. You will not need it for college admissions, okay? This is an example. This graphic here is an ACT reading passage. That does not look like fun, however. You can get through it. Some students will still prefer the ACT, but you might not believe me when I show you the next slide, because that's the ACT and that's the P and SAT version of reading. Wow, that is a lot shorter. So the new SAT, the new digital test, has shorter passages that cannot go any more than 150 words. Now, the trick, of course, is that these are challenging little passages, not necessarily easier than the ACT, but they certainly are shorter. So again, ACT reading versus the new digital SAT reading passages here. Going back to ACT, this is an example of what a science passage might look like. That graphic shows sort of a cross-section of the Earth's crust, with all kinds of interesting information about, pressure and temperatures. So again, this might not be your classic 11th grade chemistry class or biology 9th grade, but it's a scientific topic, and there might be some basic math and certainly some reading skills that your student will use to get through the science. So that's, again, what roughly the science sections would look like on the ACT. And one more quick list of the compare and contrast between the two might start pointing you in one direction or the next. So here we have the timing. Math on the new SAT, there's 2 math sections, remember, half of your score. ACT math is only 1/4 of your score. It's 1 out of the 4 subsections. SAT has 44 total questions. ACT packs 60 questions into 1 hour. The other thing I think is kind of a positive about the ACT is that the math is 100% multiple choice. On the SAT, there are the last 4 to 7 questions in each section are what's called student-produced responses. They used to be called grid-ins. So in other words, there's a whole math question, but instead of A, B, C, D, like on the ACT, you just have 4 blank boxes. So there are a number of questions on the new SAT where students have to write in their own answers. There is no way to sort of guess and pick up a few extra points. ACT remains 100% multiple choice, but you have a little less time per question. You actually have a minute and a half, 95 seconds for SAT math, and you only have 60 seconds per ACT math question. Moving on to verbal, you have SAT, again, 2 sections, half of your score, sort of evenly split between the grammar and the reading. ACT, they parcel it out individually. Grammar is called English, 35 minutes of reading is reading. And then we include the science in there just because it does use a little more of your reading skills. And again, you have more ACT questions and less time per question to do them. So ACT is the faster of the two. There's no way around that. However, again, for my 40% of students who like ACT, they would describe the ACT as more straightforward. So even though it's faster, even though there's more questions, our students who like ACT, again, would say that it's more straightforward and they just can move through it at an easier pace for them as a student. So again, PSAT is a great way to check out potential for SAT. If your school is given a practice ACT or even a pre-ACT, we can use those numbers to determine which test to pick, or you can get a free test from the ACT website, actstudent.org, or email or call me, and I will set up a complimentary ACT for your student if that's something you're interested in checking out. And then what I do is I just crunch the numbers, just like every college and university does. I do this probably 20 times a day. So here is an example from left to right across the bottom is your ACT scaled score. The little circle there shows this student had a 22 on her practice test, but she shared that she got a 1200 on her PSAT, which again is standing in for SAT. And for that young person, the 1200 was the more valuable baseline practice. The 1200 is actually equal to more like a 25 on the ACT scale. So for that person, we recommended that she pursue the SAT, right? So again, colleges and universities using these same charts that I use, we help evaluate tests and then make a decision. Sometimes kids are in the same ballpark. So you have maybe the natural, really, high scoring student tries the ACT, gets a 31 out of 36, pretty exciting. But that kid also got a big old 1400 on the PSAT. So now you have a student in that judgment call zone where they could go either way, right? They're starting on equal footing. Some students, again, love the new digital test because it is shorter and it's on a device. Other kids like that hands-on old school paper and pencil ACT experience. So as a test prep provider, I wouldn't push the student into one or the other. I would talk through preferences, comfort level with each test, even the dates of the tests, and help the student make a decision between the two. And that's how we do it. All right, so when does all this fun stuff happen? Well, it's not the same answer for everyone, like most things in life, but I'm going to show you the most common timelines for when students will prepare for their official SAT or ACT. The vast majority fall into that middle column that says traditional, and that's happening basically right now. So winter to spring of 11th grade, where the first SAT or ACT is likely March, April, or May, is the most common timeline for when students might prepare for the official SAT or ACT. On the left, the early timeline would describe a student who wants to start a little earlier, potentially do their prep in the summer leading into the 11th grade. That usually is a student who is a very strong test taker. Maybe she has the potential to be recognized as a National Merit Scholar. That, by the way, is the competition for the best performers specifically on the PSAT, right? You can be a National Merit Scholar if in October of 11th grade, you hit one of the top 1% scores in your state. So they have different cutoff numbers for each state, but those early test takers might be looking at the fall of 11th grade because they are strong test takers. They want to shoot for national merit. They might also just need early numbers. Maybe they're a recruited athlete. Coaches are asking for scores on the early side. Maybe they're going to a junior year abroad program in spring of 11th grade. So they want to do everything first semester. But the timelines that I'm speaking of, by the way, usually mean about 3 months of prep. Okay, so that timeline of weekly lessons, whether you do it yourself, you go with a company, you take a class, 2 to 3 months before, sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter, depending on the student, is what I'm referring to when I talk about a timeline of test prep. So many people are in the middle of it now, or they're just starting because they want to look at May or June. The deferred timeline would be a student who is just either not the best test taker, they kind of need to get through the 11th grade, finish up their math classes, really focus on grades. And they would do the majority of their prep the summer going into the 12th grade, believe it or not, where maybe there's even one school on the list that they, need scores. Maybe they're looking at a school in Florida, something like that. Well, we can help them later. Let them get through the 11th grade and do the later or deferred timeline where their target dates would be late summer and even early fall of the 12th grade. So those are your possible test timelines for students. And here's a list that everybody, of course, wants to know. When are these tests taking place? SAT, again, coming up this spring. We have March 9th, May 4th, and June 1st. Then it jumps to August 24th, early October, early November. You will get your scores back from August 24th and even October 5th in time for November 1st or November 15th for early decision and early action. So there's multiple dates that students can consider. ACT, February 10th, April 13th, June 8th, and there is a July, which is kind of cool. And then it's offered again in September and late October. So those are the dates that students are considering. And again, that rough ramp up to their first test is usually about 3 months of prep, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. Everything can be customized. All right, so now I want to go back to our sample student, Sally student, our case study, so we don't forget about her, and talk about her progress and history of practice testing and Compass tutoring. So if we go back to Sally student's really early 10th grade number, she had a 1080 on a PSAT. But by the time she started her Compass test prep, which was November of 11th grade, without any test prep, her numbers were up a bit. She started at a 1220. So now with Georgetown on her list and Fordham and BC, she was more hopeful that she could get her score above a 1400. And in fact, her and her parents were greatly hoping for 1450 or better. So the practice test, again, started with a 1220. Let's get excited. Now her second practice test actually went down 20 points after some tutoring, right? And I probably had to calm them down and assure them that the numbers will turn upward again. But a lot of times we do see fluctuations. So just be ready for that sometimes students will go up and down before they kind of find their footing and see a much bigger increase. So again, this is the profile of a student who started around a 1220, took practice tests along the way, and then ended up in May of her 11th grade year with a pretty nice score increase, 1400. She went up dramatically in the math, not quite as much in the verbal. So then we consulted. That, of course, is not me. That's my colleague, Kelly. But she talked to Sally's student and talked through the 1400 outcome in May and said, hey, I think you should try again in the fall. And Sally intelligently said, I think I might be at the peak. I don't think I can increase my math score, but I really would like to work on verbal, right? So we helped her by doing just a focus more on the verbal side and reminded her that many schools, including Georgetown, including Fordham, including Boston College, will super score your combination of best numbers. For parents my age and so on, this was not a thing back in the day necessarily. So this is what super scoring looks like. It's allows students to highlight their best numbers from multiple test dates and put together a new total. So she ended up dropping in math. Now, hey, 750 to 700, both are very respectable, but she went up another 40 points on the verbal. That gives her a super score total of a 1440. And what's great about that is she can simply report her best numbers. Now, I will say that if you get into the school of your choice, they will ask you for your full transcript. So they'll end up seeing your whole score. You can't just cherry pick math and cherry pick verbal. But at that point, they don't care because you're applying, putting forward your best total. The school gets to look at that total as part of their new average, and it highlights the student's new total score. And then I'll just show you a real quick graphic of what the ACT version of super scoring looks like. Not shockingly, it's the 4 separate parts over 2 test dates. And this young person had a 26 in April and another 26 in September, which in the old days would probably be a reason to panic. But with good old super scoring, now we have a student who's able to turn in a combined 28 using the individual parts from 2 different ACT test dates. So super scoring is a thing. It's not a universal policy. We keep track of it on our website and in our guide, but the majority of competitive schools love super scoring because it elevates not only the applicant's total score, but it elevates the average at their institution, okay? All right, so what is test prep? Again, lots of free resources out there. College Board has this app called Blue Book, which is just free downloadable digital practice tests. ACT has a $12 book you can order on Amazon with 6 tests in it and answer keys in the back. So there's lots of DIY type solutions. If you are considering test prep, I just like to go over what we cover and some examples of kind of the insider world of test prep to give you a preview of what Compass can provide and also just help you look for good test prep out there in the world. So the 4 major things are content, right? What to expect on the test. You can use all the tricks in the world, all the strategies, but if you don't know the basics of English grammar, if you don't do a little review on geometry concepts or the older Algebra 1 and Algebra 2 concepts, it's going to be hard to apply strategy. So we have to review and look at the content. Now, the strategies, arguably, of these 4 end up for a lot of kids being the most important piece because consistency of approach, even for students at a high level, can be a difference maker between, let's say, a 670, 680 and a 740, right? So using strategies consistently every time they see a new question, every time they try a practice test, those really help students get to their own personal next level. Time management is just a matter of test taking, right? Even if you have extended time, right? You still have to parcel out how much effort you put into each section of each test. And a good test prep program can customize that for the student. The 4th one, the yellow, emotional control. Well, you know, hey, if Compass knew exactly how to de-stress every nervous test taker, we'd be the only game in town. But unfortunately, there isn't just a black and white answer for that. But what I can offer is because of the structure of our curriculum, our reliable practice tests, and our really detailed score reports, and our experienced tutors, we do everything we can to alleviate that anxiety that comes with test taking and, you know, getting people to eat a good breakfast the morning of, getting people to understand that, hey, if your score isn't exactly where it needs to be, you've got another shot at the test. Or, hey, you might be looking at more optional schools, but let's just go in there and do our best. So we try to help students be calm and prepped when they go into the test. And those, again, are the four, I would say, major parts of a successful test prep program. And then finally, just the quick little interesting insider info. I love these two slides. I'm not going to go through every ACT or every SAT piece of the test, but this colorful graphic is a representation of from A through K, sort of top to bottom. Those represent 11 different real ACT English sections. The green blocks represent students getting that question correct, right? So you'll see the green means that most students, when they got to that question, got it right. The orange and the red indicate students missed those questions for the most part. The thing that I like to point out about this slide is that in Form A, again, a real test with 75 questions, a lot of kids got number 3 incorrect. In Form E, a lot of kids got the first one correct. So the reason why I'm showing you this is to make an example of the fact that the English section on the ACT test does not go in order precisely. It's difficulty based on the questions, not where they are located, okay? So students should spend roughly equal time across the different English subsections and then sort of pick off or cherry pick the questions that they know they can get right. Now, I see as well as you do that there is a little more red and yellow at the end of the ACT English section. And yes, timing does become a factor where kids get them wrong because they're rushing. But again, I promise you that they're actually not more difficult in those last 10 or 15 questions. But you know what is? Math. So math goes this gradient green to yellow to red because there are more clusters of the most difficult questions at the end. So again, I'm just showing you those two slides. English, which is sort of a beautiful cornucopia. And then we have math, which is more the traditional easier to medium to difficult. So the way a student, depending on their skill set, would approach the English and the math will vary. And if you're just going in blind without this kind of guidance, you wouldn't know that. So I just like to point that out and kind of show you the things that we help students navigate in this wonderful world of test prep. So here's a few things that we may be able to help with. All of this, again, is found on our website. The first is group courses that are one price, $8.95 per student. These are online group classes where students get an equal look at math and verbal. They usually start about 2 months before their target test date. We also have mini courses, which are 4 weeks, but it packs in twice a week classes, things like that. So we have group classes that are relatively affordable, very thorough. You get all of our curriculum and a nice library of full-length practice tests. And then my work as a one-on-one director is for customizing programs for those who are interested in private Compass tutoring. A lot of the work we do is nowadays over Zoom, but in Houston, we do have some in-person options too, and the pricing will vary depending on how many lessons you need, whether it is in-home or online. And we do a lot of work to make sure that the match between the student and the tutor is solid. And I, again, would be your contact as a potential director to talk through needs for one-on-one. So I'm going to leave this slide up that just outlines how we can help you. My direct email is just Sarah@Compass Prep. If you have questions about your student or questions for me, you can always reach out to me personally and directly, or you can call the main 800 line and be connected to a director who can help you out. So I'm going to end it there with a few minutes left to make time for questions. But I just want to, again, thank everyone for sitting through all this wonderful information. I know it's a lot. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak tonight. And thank you all who have joined us. I'm going to open the chat real quick and just see. Okay, so Danielle did also say that students can take the SAT on March 9th. And then please raise your hand. I don't see any new questions, but if anyone wants to take their mic off and speak up or add anything to the chat, I'm happy to answer any questions. Or again, you can email me if there's anything else I can cover at a later time, or if Danielle has anything you want to add, please let me know.
I mean, I think, thank you so much. There's so much information packed in there. So
Yes.
also if you're processing still, if your wheels are turning, if you aren't the person who got the 1600 on the SAT, but your child might be, you might need more time to process this information. No, Maria, I see, has a question.
I do. Thank you so much. This is really, really helpful.
You're welcome.
And honestly, and I actually didn't think that I was going to get a ton out of it. So Danielle said that because my oldest did get a 1600 on his SAT. And I don't know if it was because he was class of 22 and that was just the class that no one cared, but he didn't get in anywhere that he wanted to get in. He was even waitlisted at MIT. So I'm when I say I didn't think I was going to get anything out of it, I'm so turned off by, I'm like, forget it. None of it matters. Nobody cares about these anymore. But about 2 weeks ago, I think it was the Daily had a podcast and very much mirrored everything you said about the re-emerging importance of the tests. And so I have a sophomore, and she's not the test taker that our her older brother is. So I have two questions. One is about the ACT. Does it also have a way to respect 504 accommodations?
Yes, and that's where your high school counseling team can be helpful. A lot of times the default, if a student has a 504 or an IEP, is for the school to help you with College Board, because the PSAT is that sort of first big date. It also covers your AP extended time. So you do have to go through a separate process. I can help you rule it out if you'd like, you know what I mean, by doing a practice test, and then you wouldn't have to go through the request for accommodations. But the quick answer is they absolutely do. A lot of my students have extended time ACT, but it is another sort of set of paperwork and hoops to jump through to actually apply for it directly to ACT.
Okay. And Ms. Griffin is our 504 counselor, and she's excellent. And they're at Carnegie, they're on top of these things. 504 is for students who have a learning disability and require accommodations. So dyslexia, dysgraphia, or other disabilities. So for my daughter specifically.
And colleges will know that, by the way. I just like to add that in because people get nervous about that. It would be against the Americans with Disabilities Act. So when and if a student needs and gets their accommodation, there's no way the college knows that they had extended time to get that score. So just sharing that.
Okay. And then my other question is, if you have a student that, for example, on the PSAT, because so far that's all, they've done so far, at least my daughter, if they are super lopsided on their scores, like, high 90th percentile on one and, average on the other, what are your thoughts about that, other than just following College Board's recommendations that they automate?
I mean, I will say, and I hope this is maybe aligned with your experience, but if the reading is higher and the math is lower, especially for a 10th grade score, that is super normal, because a lot of times they haven't gotten through all of the math. Or if maybe they're so advanced in math that those classes are in their rearview mirror, They just need brush up. So I will say in general terms, again, very general, there's always exceptions, but in general terms, math is easier to manipulate, and that's where we usually see the bigger score jumps. English and verbal, we can improve, we do improve, but those tend to reflect lifelong learned skills and can take a little longer. So I wouldn't worry about, you know, that discrepancy, but maybe try an ACT at the same time, because math again is 1/4 rather than 50%. And some kids like the science, even though it's a little bit of a longer test. I would just, again, use practice tests to determine which one she's got that stronger baseline on.
Yeah, it's math, which was surprising to me since her disabilities are mostly with language, but I think it might be the math that was during COVID. And since it was
Very
out of my office,
Yep.
possibly my fault. I don't know. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right. I don't think I see anything new in the chat. So since it's the evening and people have families and lives and things to go, oh, here's one to get back to, we'll end, but let me read this one first. Even though the format has changed for the SAT, can a student super score? Great question. The quick answer is mostly yes, because again, it elevates the school's ability to say, this is our new total. On our blog post that has average scores, it's basically about super scoring and profiles. I don't think I can share that link at the moment, but the majority are pointing to yes, but there may be some fine print that you want to take a look at and make sure is the quick answer. It's not a universal yes or no to that question.
And the SAT, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, the SAT paper version is going away here pretty soon. So that won't be something that, okay. So it's only if you've already taken it within whatever time frame is still allowable.
Yeah, so the class, like I had quite a few class of 2025 students who did like the paper one. So they did take it in early November and early December. December 2nd, I believe, was the very last paper test. And some of those kids are not fully satisfied with their paper SAT scores. So they are going to try the new digital one in March. And again, most schools are yes to the mix and match, but do your research and, you know, just make sure. The silver lining is that the content has really not changed much. So if a student did well on the paper SAT this past fall, the likelihood that she'll do well on the new digital is very high. And of course, you know, I can help with things like practice tests and prep if you needed it.
And practicing in that format. I mean, that can,
exactly,
talking about the emotional piece of it and the anxiety and uncertainty and everything, anything we can do, I think, to help our kiddos go into it feeling confident that I may not know the question, but I know how to do the stuff. I know where to push the button. I know like what I'm allowed to bring. I know how long approximately I can spend on questions. Those things, I think, just like sort of reduce the cognitive load so that they can focus on the things that are going to help them show what they know on the test.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, unless anyone else wants to close out the evening, I think I so appreciate the feedback. You guys have been wonderful. So thank you very much for having me again.
Thank you so much. I'm sure we're going to get more questions in the, you know, in the offline channels. So, and we will post the video.
Yeah.
So anyone, you know, is able to revisit pieces of this. She included the link Sarah did for that awesome download that's chock full of data, not rumors.
Right.
From TikTok. Stay away from TikTok. If you want to maintain your, you know, mental health through this process as a parent. So anyway, thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great
night. Be well.
Bye. Thanks.